South of the Border, West of the Sun by Haruki Murakami. Chapter 1. My birthday is January 4th, 1951. The first week of the first month of the first year of the second half of the 20th century. Something to commemorate, I suppose, which is why my parents named me Hajime, beginning in Japanese. Other than that, 100% average birth. My father worked in a large stockbroker's. My mother was a typical housewife. In the war, my father was called up as a student and sent to fight in Singapore. After the surrender, he spent some time in a POW camp. My mother's house was burned down in a B-29 raid in 1945. Their generation suffered most from the long war. When I was born, though, you'd never have known there'd been a war. No more burned-out ruins, no more army of occupation. We lived in a small, quiet town, in a house which my father's company provided. The house was pre-war, somewhat old, but roomy enough. Pine trees grew in the garden, and we even had a small pond and some stone lanterns. The town where I lived was typical middle-class suburbia. My school friends all lived in neat little terraced houses. Some might have been a bit bigger than mine, but you could count on them all having similar entrances and pine trees in the garden. The works. My friends' fathers were employed in companies, or else they were professionals of some sort. Hardly anyone's mother worked, and almost everyone had a cat or a dog. No one I knew lived in a flat or an apartment. Later on, I moved to another part of town, but it was nearly identical. The upshot of this is that, until I moved to Tokyo to go to college, I was convinced everyone in the whole world lived in a single-family home with a garden and a pet, and commuted to work in a suit. I couldn't imagine a different lifestyle. In the world I grew up in, a typical family had 2 or 3 children. My childhood friends were all members of such stereotypical families. If not 2 kids in the family, then 3. If not 3, then 2. Families with 6 or 7 kids were few and far between, but even more unusual were families with only 1 child. I happened to be one of the unusual ones, since I was an only child. I had an inferiority complex about it, as if there was something different about me, that what other people all had and took for granted, I lacked. I detested the term only child. Every time I heard it, I felt I was missing something, as if I wasn't quite a complete human being. The phrase only child stood there, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Something's missing, pal," it told me. In the world I lived, it was accepted that only children were spoiled by their parents, weak and self-centered. This was a given, like the fact that the barometer goes down the higher you go, and the fact that cows give milk. That's why I hated it whenever someone asked me how many brothers and sisters I had. Just let them hear I didn't have any, and instinctively they thought, an only child, eh? Spoiled, weak, and self-centered, I bet. That kind of knee-jerk reaction depressed me and hurt. But what depressed me and hurt me more was something else. The fact that everything they thought about me was true. In the 6 years I went to elementary school, I met just one other only child. So I remember her, yes, it was a girl, clearly. I got to know her well, and we talked about all sorts of things. We understood each other. You could even say I loved her. Her last name was Shimamoto. Soon after she was born, she caught polio, which made her drag her left leg. On top of that, she'd transferred to our school at the end of 5th grade. Compared with me then, she had a terrible load of psychological baggage to struggle with. This baggage, though, had made her a tougher, more self-possessed only child than I could ever have been. She never whined or complained, never gave any indication of the irritation she must have felt at times. No matter what happened, she'd manage a smile. The worse things got, in fact, the broader her smile became. I loved her smile. It soothed me, encouraged me. It'll all be all right, her smile told me. Just hang in there, and everything will be okay. Years later, whenever I thought of her, it was her smile that came to my mind first. Shimamoto was kind to everyone. People respected her. In this sense, she and I were different, although we were both only children. This doesn't mean that everyone in our class liked her. No one teased her or made fun of her, but except for me, she had no real friends. She was probably too cool, too self-possessed. Some of the others in our class must have thought her cold and haughty, but I detected something else, something warm and fragile just below the surface, something very much like a child playing hide-and-seek, hidden deep within her, yet hoping to be found. Because her father was transferred within his company a lot, Shimamoto had been to quite a few schools. I can't remember what her father did. Once she explained to me in detail what his work was, but as with most kids, it went in one ear and out the other. I seem to recall some professional job connected with a bank or tax office or something. She lived in company housing, but the house was larger than normal, a Western-style house with a low, solid stone wall surrounding it. Above the wall was an evergreen hedge, and through gaps in it you could catch a glimpse of a garden with a lawn. Shimamoto was a large girl, about as tall as I was, with striking features. I was certain that in a few years she would be gorgeous, but when I first met her, she hadn't developed an outer look to match her inner qualities. Something about her was unbalanced, and not many people felt she was much to look at. There was an adult part of her and a part that was still a child, and they were out of sync. This made people uneasy. Probably because our houses were so close, literally a stone's throw from each other. The first month after she came to our school, she was assigned to the seat next to mine. I told her what textbooks she'd need, what the weekly tests were like, how much we'd covered in each book, how the cleaning and the serving lunch assignments were handled. Our school's policy was for the child who lived nearest any new student to help him or her out. My teacher took me aside to tell me that he expected me to take special care of Shimamoto with her lame leg. As with all kids of 11 or 12 talking to a member of the opposite sex for the first time, for a couple of days our conversations were strained. When we found out we were both only children, though, we relaxed. It was the first time either of us had met another only child. We'd both had so much we'd held inside about being only children. Often we'd walk home together, slowly, because of a leg. We'd walk the 3/4 of a mile home, talking about all kinds of things. The more we talked, the more we realized what we had in common. Our love of books and music, not to mention cats. We both had a hard time explaining our feelings to others. We both had a long list of foods we didn't want to eat. When it came to subjects at school, we had no trouble concentrating on the ones we liked. The ones we disliked, we hated to death. But there was one major difference between us. More than I did, Shimamoto consciously wrapped herself in a protective shell. Unlike me, she made an effort to study the subjects she hated, and she got good marks. When the school dinner contained food she loathed, she still ate it. In other words, she constructed a much taller defensive wall around herself than I ever built. What remained behind that wall, though, was much the same as what lay behind mine. Unlike times when I was with other girls, I could relax with Shimamoto. I loved going home with her. She limped slightly as she walked. We sometimes had a rest on a park bench halfway home, but I didn't mind. Rather the opposite. I was glad to have the extra time. Soon we began to spend a lot of time together, but I don't recall anyone teasing us about it. This didn't strike me at the time, though now it seems strange. After all, kids that age naturally make fun of any couple who seem close. It might have been because of the kind of person Shimamoto was. Something about her made other people tense. She had an air that made people think, "Wah, I better not say anything stupid in front of this girl." Even our teachers were somewhat on edge when dealing with her. Maybe her lameness had something to do with it. At any rate, most people thought Shimamoto was not the sort of person you teased, and that was fine with me. During PE, she sat on the sidelines. When our class went hiking or mountain climbing, she stayed at home. Same with summer swimming camp. On our annual sports day, she did seem a little out of sorts. But other than this, her school life was typical. Hardly ever did she mention her leg. If memory serves, not even once. Whenever we walked home from school together, she never once apologized for holding me back, or let this thought graze her expression. I knew, though, that it was precisely because her leg bothered her that she refrained from mentioning it. She didn't like to go to other kids' homes much, since she'd have to remove her shoes, Japanese style, at the entrance. The heels of her shoes were different heights, and the shoes themselves were shaped differently, something she wanted at all costs to conceal. They must have been made to measure. When she arrived at her home, the first thing she did was toss her shoes in the cupboard as fast as she could. Shimamoto's house had a brand new stereo in the living room, and I used to go over there to listen to music. It was a nice stereo. Her father's LP collection, though, didn't do it justice. At most, he had 15 records, chiefly collections of light classics. We listened to those 15 records 1,000 times, and even today I can recall the music, every single note. Shimamoto was in charge of the records. She'd take one from its sleeve, place it carefully on the turntable without touching the grooves with her fingers, and after making sure to clean the cartridge of any dust with a tiny brush, lower the needle ever so gently onto the record. When the record was finished, she'd spray it and wipe it with a felt cloth. Finally, she'd return the record to its sleeve and its proper place on the shelf. Her father had taught her this procedure, and she'd followed his instructions with a terribly serious look on her face. Her eyes narrowed, her breath held in check. Meanwhile, I sat on the sofa watching her every move. Only when the record was safely back on the shelf did she turn to me and give a little smile. And every time this thought hit me. It wasn't a record she was handling. It was a fragile soul inside a glass bottle. In my house, we didn't have records or a record player. My parents didn't care much for music, so I was always listening to music on a small plastic AM radio. Rock and roll was my favorite, but before long, I grew to enjoy Shimamoto's brand of classical music. This was music from another world, which had its appeal, but more than that, I loved it because she was a part of that world. Once or twice a week, she and I would sit on the sofa drinking the tea her mother made for us and spend the afternoon listening to Rossini overtures, Beethoven's Pastoral, and the Peer Gynt Suite. Her mother was happy for me to be there. She was pleased her daughter had a friend so soon after transferring to a new school, and I suppose it helped that I was neatly dressed. Honestly, I couldn't bring myself to like her mother very much. There was no particular reason I felt that way. She was always nice to me, but I could detect a hint of irritation in her voice, and it put me on edge. Of all her father's records, the one I liked best was a recording of Liszt piano concertos, one concerto on each side. I liked it for two reasons. First of all, the record sleeve was beautiful. Second, no one I knew, with the exception of Shimamoto, of course, ever listened to Liszt's piano concertos. The very idea excited me. I had found a world that no one around me knew. A secret garden only I was allowed to enter. I felt elevated, lifted to another plane of existence. And the music itself was wonderful. At first, it struck me as exaggerated, artificial, even incomprehensible. Little by little, though, with repeated listenings, a vague image formed in my mind. An image that had meaning. When I closed my eyes and concentrated, the music came to me as a series of whirlpools. One whirlpool would form, and out of it another would take shape. And the second whirlpool would connect up with a third. Those whirlpools, I realize now, had a conceptual, abstract quality to them. More than anything, I wanted to tell Shimamoto about them, but they were beyond ordinary language. An entirely different set of words was needed, but I had no idea what they were. What's more, I didn't know if what I was feeling was worth putting into words. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the pianist now. All I can recall are the colourful, vivid record sleeve and the weight of the record itself. The record was hefty and thick in a mysterious way. The collection in her house included one record each by Nat King Cole and Bing Crosby. We listened to those two a lot. The Crosby one featured Christmas songs, which we enjoyed regardless of the season. It's strange how we could enjoy something like that over and over again. One December day, near Christmas, Shimamoto and I were sitting in her living room, on the sofa, as usual, listening to records. Her mother was out of the house on some errand, and we were alone. It was a cloudy, dark winter afternoon. The sun's rays, streaked with fine dust, barely shone through the heavy layer of clouds. Everything looked dim and motionless. It was nearing twilight, and the room was as dark as night. A paraffin heater bathed the room in a faint glow. Nat King Cole was singing Pretend. Of course, we had no idea then what the English lyrics meant. To us, they were more like a chant. But I loved the song, and I heard it so many times I could imitate the opening lines. Pretend you're happy when you're blue. It isn't very hard to do. The song and the lovely smile that always graced Shimamoto's face were one and the same to me. The lyrics seemed to express a certain way of looking at life, though at times I found it hard to see life in that way. Shimamoto had on a blue sweater with a round neck. She owned a fair number of blue sweaters. It must have been her favorite color, or maybe she wore those sweaters because they went well with a navy blue coat she always wore to school. The white collar of her blouse peeped out at her throat. A check skirt and white cotton socks completed her outfit. Her soft, tight sweater revealed the slight swell of her breasts. She sat on the sofa with both legs folded beneath her. One elbow resting on the back of the sofa, she stared at some far-off imaginary scene as she listened to the music. Do you think it's true what they say? That parents of only children don't get on very well? She asked. I mulled over the idea, but I couldn't work out its cause and effect. Where did you hear that? I asked. Somebody said that to me a long time ago. Parents who don't get on very well end up having only one child. It made me so sad when I heard that. I said. Do your mother and father get on all right? I couldn't answer right away. I'd never thought about it before. My mother isn't too strong physically, I said. I'm not sure, but it was probably too much of a strain for her to have another child after me. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to have a brother or sister? No. Why not? I picked up the record sleeve on the table. It was too dark to read what was written on it. I put it down and rubbed my eyes a couple of times with my wrist. My mother had once asked me the same question. The answer I gave then didn't make her happy or sad. It just puzzled her. But for me, it was a totally honest, totally sincere answer. The things I wanted to say got all jumbled up as I talked, and my explanation seemed to go on forever. But what I was trying to get across was this. The me that's here now has been brought up without any brothers or sisters. If I did have brothers or sisters, I wouldn't be the me I am. So it's unnatural for the me that's here before you to think about what it would be like to have brothers or sisters. In other words, I thought my mother's question was pointless. I gave the same answer to Shimamoto. She gazed at me steadily as I talked. Something about her expression pulled people in. It was as if, this is something I thought of only later, of course, she were gently peeling back, one after another, the layers that covered a person's heart. A very sensual feeling. Her lips moved ever so slightly with each change in her expression. I could catch a glimpse, deep within her eyes, of a faint light, like a tiny candle flickering in the dark, narrow room. I think I understand what you mean, she said in a mature, quiet voice. Really? She answered. There are some things in this world that can be changed, and some that can't. And time passing is one thing that can't be redone. Come this far, and you can't go back. Don't you think so? I nodded. After a certain length of time has passed, things harden, like cement, in a bucket, and we can't go back anymore. What you want to say is that the cement that makes you up has set, so the you are now can't be anyone else. I guess that's what I mean, I said uncertainly. Shimamoto looked at her hands for a time. Sometimes, I start thinking about after I grow up and get married. I think about what kind of house I'll live in, what I'll do. I think about how many children I'll have. Wow, I said. Haven't you ever thought about that? I shook my head. How could a 12-year-old boy be expected to think about that? So how many kids do you want to have? Her hand, which up until then had lain on the back of the sofa, she now placed on her knee. I stared vacantly at her fingers tracing the plaid pattern of her skirt. There was something curious about it, as if invisible thread emanating from her fingertips was spinning together an entirely new concept of time. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness, whirlpools flashed before me. Countless whirlpools were born and disappeared without a sound. Off in the distance, Nat King Cole was singing South of the Border. The song was about Mexico, but at the time I had no idea. The words South of the Border had a strange, appealing ring to them. I was convinced something utterly wonderful lay south of the border. When I opened my eyes, Shimamoto was still moving her fingers along her skirt. Somewhere deep inside my body, I felt an exquisitely sweet ache. It's strange, she said, but when I think about children, I can only imagine having one. I can somehow picture myself having children. I'm a mother and I have a child. I have no problem with that. But I can't picture that child having any brothers or sisters. It's an only child, She was, without a doubt, a precocious girl. I feel sure she was attracted to me as a member of the opposite sex, a feeling I reciprocated, but I had no idea how to deal with those feelings. Shimamoto didn't either, I suspect. We held hands just once. She was leading me somewhere and grabbed my hand as if to say, "This way, hurry up." Our hands were clasped together for 10 seconds at most, but to me it felt more like 30 minutes. When she let go of my hand, I was suddenly lost. It was all very natural, the way she took my hand, but I knew she'd been dying to. The feel of her hand has never left me. It was different from any other hand I'd ever held, different from any touch I'd ever known. It was merely the small, warm hand of a 12-year-old girl, yet those fingers and that palm were like a display case crammed full of everything I wanted to know, and everything I had to know. By taking my hand, she showed me what those things were. That within the world, a place like this existed. In the space of those 10 seconds, I became a tiny bird, fluttering into the air, the wind rushing by. From high in the sky, I could see a scene far away. It was so far off, I couldn't make it out clearly, yet something was there, and I knew that someday I would travel to that place. This revelation made me catch my breath and made my chest tremble. I returned home, and sitting at my desk, I gazed for a long time at the fingers Shimamoto had clasped. I was ecstatic that she'd held my hand. Her gentle touch warmed my heart for days. At the same time, it confused me, made me perplexed, even sad in a way. How could I possibly come to terms with that warmth? When we left elementary school, Shimamoto and I went on to separate junior highs. I moved from the home I had lived in till then to a new town. I say to a new town, but it was only 2 stops on the train from where I grew up. And in the first 3 months after I moved, I went to see her 3 or 4 times. But that was it. Finally, I stopped going. We were both at a delicate age, where the mere fact that we went to different schools and lived 2 train stops apart was all it took for me to feel our worlds had completely changed. Our friends were different. So were our uniforms and textbooks. My body, my voice, my way of thinking were undergoing sudden changes, and an unexpected awkwardness threatened the intimate world we had created. Shimamoto, of course, was going through even greater physical and psychological changes, and all of this made me uncomfortable. Her mother began to look at me in a strange way. "Why does this boy keep coming here?" she seemed to be saying. "He no longer lives in this neighborhood, and he goes to a different school." Maybe I was just being too sensitive. So Shimamoto and I grew apart, and I ended up not seeing her anymore. And that was probably is the only word I can think of to use here. I don't consider it my job to investigate the expanse of memory called the past and judge what is correct and what isn't. A mistake. I should have stayed as close as I could to her. I needed her, and she needed me. But my self-consciousness was too strong, and I was too afraid of being hurt. I never saw her again, until many years later, that is. Even after we stopped seeing each other, I thought of her with great fondness. Memories of her encouraged me, soothed me, as I passed through the confusion and pain of adolescence. For a long time, she held a special place in my heart. I kept this special place just for her, like a reserved sign on a quiet corner table in a restaurant, despite the fact that I was sure I'd never see her again. When I knew her, I was still 12 years old, without any real sexual feelings or desire, though I'll admit to a vaguely formed interest in the swell of her breasts and what lay beneath her skirt. But I had no idea what this meant or where it might lead. With ears perked up and eyes closed, I imagined the existence of a certain place. This place where I imagined was still incomplete. It was misty, indistinct, its outlines vague. Yet I was sure that something absolutely vital was waiting for me there. And I knew this, that Shimamoto was gazing at the same scene. We were, the two of us, still fragmentary beings, just beginning to sense the presence of an unexpected, to-be-acquired reality that would fill us and make us whole. We stood in front of a door we'd never seen before, the two of us alone, beneath a glimmer of light, our hands tightly clasped together for a fleeting 10 seconds of time. End of chapter 1.